Thank you, Mr. President. I rise this morning to express concern for the people of Ukraine and the hundreds of millions who are going to bed hungry across the globe. Every day since that terrible day, February 24th, we watched in horror as Vladimir Putin and his army, his forces, kill innocent Ukrainians over and over and over again, like nothing we've seen since World War II. Russian forces continue to besiege and shell Ukrainian cities like Mariupol, where over the last 2 months civilians have lived in bunkers under perpetual fire. These are civilians in those bunkers. Only yesterday, 130 civilians managed to escape the battered Azovstal steel plant. Describing the last several months, one evacuee said, quote, "You can't imagine how scary it is when you sit in the shelter in a wet and damp basement which is bouncing, shaking. We are praying to God that missiles fly over our shelter, because if it hit the shelter, all of us would be done," unquote. Sadly, 200 more Ukrainian civilians have been unable to evacuate even as Russian forces began storming the steel mill just yesterday. So our prayers are with them and the remaining brave Ukrainian fighters continuing to hold on to this plant. But atrocities continue across all of Ukraine. In Donetsk, yesterday, 3 civilians were killed on their way to collecting water for their families. The United States, of course, must continue to help Ukraine fight against Mr. Putin and his forces. Mr. Putin is the incarnation of evil. It's as clear as any debate could be. The good news is countries all over the world are unified against him, but we have a long way to go. Now, I and so many others across the House and the Senate strongly supported the appropriation that Congress made back in March, $13.6 billion in emergency appropriations to support Ukraine, and I stand by President Biden's recent $33 billion request to help Ukraine defend itself over the long term. Unfortunately, in that first number, the $13.6 billion, the good news is we had support for that in both parties. But I have to say, for the record, not enough support on the Republican side. Here in the Senate, 31 Republicans voted against the $13.6 billion. And when you add up the Senate Republicans voting against the $13.6 billion in the spending bill and add them to the House Republicans, which is obviously a much bigger number, it's more than 200 members of the Republican Party in the United States Congress voted against every single penny of the $13.6 billion for Ukraine. So I hope when it comes to the $33 billion that I hope we'll be able to pass, but I'm sure it'll be a number at least comparable to that. But whatever the number is for the people of Ukraine, I hope that we will get unanimous support in the United States Congress. I hope we won't see more than 200 members of Republicans in the Congress voting against the people of Ukraine. This is not a difficult choice. You're either on one side or the other. I said Mr. Putin's the incarnation of evil. He is. The good news is we have another choice. The other choice is Mr. Zelensky, the people of Ukraine, and those brave fighters in Ukraine. They are the personification of all that we claim to stand for when we talk about democracy. This isn't a moment to theorize or to talk about democracy in glowing terms without taking actions. They're doing the fighting on the battlefield. The least that we can do is vote the right way. That's the power you have as a member of Congress. House, Senate, Democrat, Republican, or Independent. You have the power to vote, and I hope that we'll have unanimous support for the $33 billion that the President has asked for. Now, what will that funding entail? I won't go through all of it, but this funding will include $20.4 billion in additional security and military assistance for Ukraine. It's important to put that into context. So it's basically 20 of the 33 will be for security and military assistance. That is on top of what has already been appropriated just since the war in Ukraine started when Russia invaded. With President Biden's leadership and with a lot of support in the Congress, we've been able to provide billions of dollars just on the military and security assistance, not to mention the humanitarian support, the sanctions, and the unified approach that so many countries around the world have taken. But we have a lot more to do. And in my judgment, the $33 billion won't be enough. We're going to be back at it probably in a few months, providing more. But at a minimum, we've got to get this done for the people of Ukraine. Part of that appropriation will be the replenishing of donated NATO weapons and equipment. This help in total, all of this security assistance and other humanitarian support, will be critical to Ukraine's ability to prevail over Russian forces through the summer and the fall. We must continue to provide all of the artillery, the anti-tank, the anti-air weapons, and air defense systems, and other capabilities that Ukraine can use to block Russian authoritarianism and support the Ukrainian people. However, regardless of how much support the United States, NATO, and our other allies and partners provide, we must remember that nothing we do is comparable to the awesome sacrifice for freedom and democracy that Ukrainians are now making every day. When they give their lives in this war and have their own families shattered in the process. They are upholding the people of Ukraine, those brave fighters on the battlefield every day, every week, every month now. Those Ukrainians are upholding democracy, not just for themselves, not just for our country, but for the entire free world. There are, of course, other consequences to this war. The war has already driven over 13 million Ukrainians from their homes. These Ukrainians who are either refugees going to another country or internally displaced within Ukraine but are outside of their homes, that number is equal to the entire population, roughly equivalent, 13 million, to the entire population of my home state of Pennsylvania. Just imagine that. 13 million people being displaced. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like that will be the end. So I want to commend the European Union and Ukrainian neighbors in the region for their warm welcome to such an unprecedented refugee flow from Ukraine. Now, recently, just 2 weeks ago, traveling through Italy, Georgia, and France, I saw everyday Italians, Georgians, Frenchmen and French women opening their hearts and their homes to Ukrainian refugees, not to mention the people of Poland who have done so much and so many others. Just one example, in Italy, faith-based nonprofits like Sant'Egidio, that we had time to meet with on our trip, have led the way in providing support to those in need. I also commend the administration's work to support these refugees across Europe and those remaining in Ukraine, much of that work funded by part of the $13.6 billion that Congress appropriated in March. Let me move to another topic, but it's directly related to what we just talked about, food security. Our work on the overall strategy as it relates to the people of Ukraine and protecting democracy is far from complete, as the world has not yet felt the full effect, the full brunt of the global effects of Mr. Putin's unprovoked, unlawful, and certainly unjustified war. While millions of Ukrainians have already become refugees or internally displaced people, there are food shortages in more than 1/3 of the country. By the end of the year, tens of millions across the globe also will face immediate danger from hunger. So this is a crisis for the people of Ukraine on a whole host of fronts, obviously, but it's also a food security crisis for the world at the same time. The reason for that immediate danger that people face right now, being unable to find the food that they need to survive, is because of this invasion, as well as obviously the terrible impact the pandemic has had. As a breadbasket of the world, before the war, Ukraine fed over 400 million people across the globe. And the greater Black Sea area exported more than 12% of the food calories that are traded worldwide. The war has cut off these supplies while also raising fuel and transportation costs. There is less food to go around, and it costs more to get food to those who need it the most. This comes on top of the COVID-19 pandemic, as I mentioned, which increased hunger and complicated supply chains and climate change's effects like severe droughts and floods. It also costs more to grow food, as Russia previously dominated the world's fertilizer markets. Today, both food and fertilizer prices have skyrocketed to higher than ever before. The World Food Program estimates that 878 million people across 92 countries of the world do not have adequate food on their table. 878 million people. Over 276 million people now face acute food insecurity, meaning that they are in immediate danger from not being able to find their next meal. So they are the ones in the most trouble right now, all across the world, 276 million. It's not all the folks that are hungry and have a food security crisis, but those are in immediate danger. Due to Putin's horrific war, by the end of 2022, another 47 million people will likely face those same dangers. 47 million people. That will mean that around the world, almost as many people live in the entire United States will face immediate danger from hunger. Most of these people live outside of Ukraine in the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, where any further price shock may put entire communities at risk. I'll resume my comments about food security. As I mentioned earlier, across the world now, we not only have 276 million people who now face acute food insecurity, as I said, meaning that they're in immediate danger from not being able to find their next meal. But what's ahead is an exacerbation of that problem. Another 47 million people will likely face these same dangers by the end of this year. So a food security problem which was a substantial problem before the pandemic, made ever worse by the pandemic, has gotten much worse because of the war in Ukraine, all caused by an attack on a sovereign country by a brutal dictator, Mr. Putin. So this is one of the many reasons why this war in Ukraine, or why all of us, I should say, across the free world have a stake in what happens in Ukraine. I wanted to also highlight what the United States is doing in the midst of this terrible food insecurity crisis. We can't afford to forget and should not forget about the tens of millions that are struggling to survive as a result of this invasion. To feed all of those in need, the World Food Program, which does such good work all across the globe, goes into conflict zones to provide food to people. That program estimates it'll take more than $18 billion. The United States must not share this burden alone, but if we don't lead the way, no one will. That's true in so many instances. It's true with regard to the President's leadership against Mr. Putin by helping the people of Ukraine. It's also true in terms of American leadership on food security. President Biden has his $33 billion request for all aspects of the challenge in Ukraine doesn't include enough, in my judgment. It includes $1.6 billion for food security and humanitarian assistance. Now, that sounds like a lot of money, but it's not enough to meet the moment. And despite my consistent urging, Congress has appropriated flat funding for the United States' food security program, Feed the Future, over the last 10 years. Adjusting for inflation, the program has been cut by almost a third of its total programming, from almost $1.5 billion in today's dollars to just over $1 billion. So today we face the same global food crisis which the Feed the Future program was originally created to address after the 2008 recession. So after a recession, we had a global food security challenge, and now after a pandemic and exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, we have potentially an even greater challenge. So we must again rise to the challenge. When I say we, I mean the United States government, the Congress, the branch of our government that appropriates money, has to rise to the challenge by providing the resources that are necessary to feed those who face famine. Not just missing a meal here and there, famine itself. We've got to support these smallholder farmers who are the backbone of the world food supply, and sustainably strengthen food systems to protect against the next war, the next pandemic, the next drought, or the next flood. So that's why I'm leading a letter to appropriators urging robust funding of all global food security accounts in the fiscal year 2023 budget, specifically calling for an almost $200 million increase just for the Feed the Future program, not to mention those other global food security programs and accounts. This funding will only put a dent in the growing food security crisis, but it will inspire our allies and our partners to follow us. America leads the world in so many ways, and fortunately, most of the time on food security, we have led the world as well. We need to do that again. We need to lay the groundwork for a more secure food future and save tens and tens of thousands of lives, potentially a lot more than that in the immediate future. Now, Mr. President, I'll move to one final topic before I conclude. And this is a topic that we're hearing more about because of the pandemic and because of legislation we're working on right now. Today and tomorrow, as the Majority Leader made reference to, we're going to be voting here in the Senate on measures ahead of a conference, kind of a coming together of the House and the Senate to work out differences on landmark legislation aimed at addressing U.S. economic competition with the Chinese Communist Party and investing in American workers. As the House and Senate proceed to this conference on the Senate-passed U.S. Innovation and Competition Act and the House version, which is called the Competes Act, I urge bipartisan leadership in both House and Senate to negotiate in good faith and ensure substantive provisions that support the interests of American workers, supply chains, and security. Key among these provisions in the trade title of the House Competes Act, and within it the bipartisan, bicameral National Critical Capabilities Defense Act, which both Senator Cornyn and I wrote and have led the effort on to pass this legislation. In the House, Representatives Pascrell and DeLauro have worked on this as well. The pandemic exacerbated a problem that's been decades in the making. Here it is. The United States has ceded its manufacturing power to other countries, especially countries like China, that don't play by the rules. From the PPE shortages that we all know so much about at the beginning of the pandemic, I mean, we couldn't even provide enough masks, gloves, and gowns for our own people. That was an American failure that was long in the making. We cannot allow that to happen. But of course, PPE doesn't end the story. We've ceded our manufacturing power to other parts of the world in so many other ways. For too long, corporations have prioritized their profits over anything else. They've prioritized those profits over offshoring their manufacturing to countries with low labor standards that undercut American workers, and lowering the cost of, thereby, I should say, lowering the cost of design and production all across the board. So offshoring manufacturing, our manufacturing capability, the best in the world, I would argue. Why would we offshore it like we have over a generation? And offshoring our supply chains has gotten so bad that it's now putting our economic security at risk, but it's also putting our national security at risk. This issue is that, the issue is, I should say, that we don't even know how bad the problem is. At its core, this bill, the National Critical Capabilities Defense Act, is a transparency effort. We need to know how much we're relying on foreign adversaries for both the design and manufacturing of goods that are critical to our economic and national security interests. Once we know that, we can start investing in domestic manufacturing strategically, which will lower costs for families, provide good-paying jobs to American workers, and ensure that we're no longer relying on adversaries for the basic functions of our economy. This is a common sense policy, and that's why this bill has bipartisan support in the House and the Senate. Members of the Senate are coming together on this who often don't agree on much, but agree that we've got to protect our manufacturing base. We cannot be at the mercy of other countries in a pandemic, or more generally when it comes to our economic interests, but also our security interests. That's why Biden administration officials, from the National Security Advisor to the Secretary of Commerce, have acknowledged a need to review outbound investment. Even former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster has proposed some form of a government outbound investment review mechanism. So, Mr. President, I recognize that this is not an easy problem to solve, not an easy mechanism to create within the bureaucracy of the federal government, but this critical moment calls for having to do the hard work to ensure we're meeting the economic and national security challenges of the day. This is a moment to do the work to set our government and the American people up for success in a world where the Chinese Communist Party will continue to incentivize American investment into that country and away from the United States, thereby eroding the foundation of American power, which is leveraging our economic might to uphold liberal democratic norms, the same norms that are being challenged every day in places like Ukraine. So this is why I urge my colleagues in leadership to work with me and to work with others in a bipartisan, bicameral effort to negotiate and hammer out the details of this legislation to ensure the inclusion of this critical legislation in a final competitiveness package. There's no reason why, if a company is outsourcing technology, outsourcing a product that compromises or has the potential to compromise our national security, we not only should know about that, but we should have the opportunity as a government whose first duty is to protect our national security. That same government, the United States government, should be able to review those transactions and make a determination about whether or not that outsourcing will put us at a disadvantage. That is a reasonable request for people in both parties, both houses, and the administration. And it's about time we did this. It is long overdue. So this isn't simply we couldn't make enough masks and had to rely upon other countries in a pandemic. That's bad enough. That was embarrassing enough. This is a lot more than PPE. This is about our economic security and our national security. And there's no reason why those kinds of investment that companies make every day, sometimes without any thought about what it will do to our security, there's no reason why that shouldn't be the subject of an appropriate review to protect our national security. So, Mr. President, with that, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.